On a dusty plain outside a city called Adrianople, an emperor rode out to destroy a band of refugees. And by nightfall, 2/3 of his army lay dead, and so did he. 16 centuries later, on that same date, a bomber named Boxcar would end a world war forever. A president would leave the White House in disgrace. A sprinter would humiliate a dictator's master race theory in front of 100,000 people. And a small island nation would be born from rejection. One date on the calendar, 5 different centuries, all connected by a single, brutal truth. History moves fastest when power breaks. This is August 9th. By 378, Rome had stood for over 1,000 years, and its legions had never truly known what it meant to lose. That confidence would die on August 9th, outside a small city in what is now Turkey. Thousands of Gothic refugees, the Visigoths, had been led across the Danube 2 years earlier, fleeing the Huns, only to be starved and exploited by corrupt Roman officials. Desperate and betrayed, they rose in revolt. Emperor Valens, proud and eager for a victory of his own, marched out to crush them before his nephew Gratian could arrive to share the glory. He had bad intelligence. Scouts told him the Goths numbered only 10,000. In truth, the camp on the hill above Adrianople held far more, reinforced by Gothic and Ostrogothic cavalry hidden in the countryside. Roman units attacked without orders, threw the whole line into chaos, and then the horsemen struck. The disciplined Roman infantry, packed too tightly to swing a sword, was surrounded and slaughtered. An estimated 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army died that afternoon. Some accounts say up to 40,000 men. Valens himself vanished into the smoke and slaughter. His body was never found. It wasn't the end of Rome, but it was the day the myth of Roman invincibility died, and the barbarian kingdoms that would eventually inherit the Western Empire took their first real step toward power. History rarely announces its turning points in advance. Sometimes they arrive as a single bad decision on a hot afternoon. Not every turning point on this date came soaked in blood. On August 9th, 1854, a former schoolteacher named Henry David Thoreau published a book that had taken him nearly a decade to write. He called it Walden. It told the story of 2 years he'd spent living simply in a small cabin near Walden Pond in Massachusetts, not as an escape from the world, but as an experiment in what a person truly needed to live well. In an era racing toward industrialization, Thoreau's message was almost radical. Slow down, pay attention, want less. The book sold barely a few hundred copies a year during his lifetime. Critics found it strange, even self-indulgent. Thoreau died believing he'd failed to reach an audience. He had no idea that a century later, Walden would become one of the most assigned books in American classrooms, a quiet act of resistance against consumer culture, published on the same date that would one day carry far louder history. Sometimes the loudest legacies begin in silence. 82 years later, on the same August date, a very different kind of history was being written in front of 100,000 spectators. Adolf Hitler had built the 1936 Berlin Olympics to showcase Aryan supremacy to the world. He had not planned for Jesse Owens, the son of a sharecropper and grandson of enslaved people. Owens had already won 3 gold medals that week, in the 100 meters, the long jump, and the 200 meters. On August 9th, he anchored the American 4x100 meter relay team, and together they shattered the world record, finishing in 39.8 seconds, a mark that would stand for 20 years. It was Owens' 4th gold medal of the Games. Hitler, according to multiple accounts, left the stadium rather than acknowledge the achievement. Owens returned home to a country that still denied him basic civil rights. He wasn't invited to the White House and had to enter hotels through service entrances. But on that track, in that stadium, in front of the regime that built its ideology on racial hierarchy, he had already delivered the only verdict that mattered.
In 1941, the conflict expanded. The North Atlantic became a battleground.
5 years after Owens's triumph, the world was at war again, and on August 9, 1941, two men who would decide its outcome met in secret off the coast of Newfoundland. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, aboard American and British warships, began drafting what would become the Atlantic Charter, a joint statement of principles for a post-war world, months before the United States had even entered the fighting. It promised self-determination for nations, freedom from want and fear, and disarmament of aggressor states. It wasn't a treaty. It carried no legal force, but it signaled, unmistakably, where American sympathies lay, and it would later form part of the philosophical foundation for the United Nations. Two leaders, one quiet meeting at sea, and a blueprint for the peace that hadn't yet been won. While Roosevelt and Churchill planned for a post-war world of self-determination, one of the era's greatest independence movements was being crushed just as that ink dried. On August 9, 1942, British colonial authorities arrested Mahatma Gandhi in Bombay, along with dozens of other leaders of the Indian National Congress, following the launch of the Quit India movement, a mass campaign demanding an immediate end to British rule. The arrests were meant to decapitate the movement overnight. Instead, they ignited it. Protests, strikes, and unrest spread across the subcontinent for months. Gandhi himself would remain imprisoned for nearly 2 years. India would not gain its independence until 1947, 5 years later. But August 9, 1942, marked the moment the demand for freedom became impossible for the British Empire to ignore or contain. 2 years after Gandhi's arrest, on the same date, a different kind of defiance was unfolding 8,000 miles away, on a naval base in California. Weeks earlier, an explosion at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine had killed 320 men loading munitions onto cargo ships, most of them black sailors, doing dangerous work that white sailors were rarely assigned. The Navy never fully explained what caused the blast. It offered no additional safety training. Instead, it ordered the surviving black sailors back to work handling live ammunition almost immediately. On August 9, 1944, 258 of them refused. Most eventually returned under threat of court-martial. 50 did not, and they were charged with mutiny, a crime that could carry the death penalty. All 50 were convicted and sentenced to years of hard labor. Thurgood Marshall, then chief counsel for the NAACP, attended the trial and fought the convictions for years. It would take 8 decades, until 2024, for the Navy to formally exonerate the men known as the Port Chicago 50. Their refusal to work in unsafe, unequal conditions became one of the earliest organized acts of the civil rights movement within the American military. One year after Port Chicago's sailors were sentenced, the war that had demanded their labor was finally ending, through the most destructive single act in human history. 3 days after the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, a B-29 bomber named Boxcar carried a second device, nicknamed Fat Man, toward the city of Kokura. Cloud cover over the primary target forced the crew to divert to their secondary objective, Nagasaki. At 11:02 in the morning on August 9, 1945, the bomb detonated over the city. An estimated 40,000 to 74,000 people were killed instantly or in the immediate aftermath, with thousands more dying from injuries and radiation in the months that followed. 6 days later, Japan announced its surrender, bringing the Second World War to its final close. The bombing of Nagasaki remains one of history's most difficult subjects, a decision still debated by historians and ethicists more than 80 years later, weighed against estimates of casualties from a prolonged invasion. What is not in dispute is its consequence. It marked the last time nuclear weapons have been used in warfare, and it permanently changed how humanity understood the stakes of conflict between great powers. 20 years after Nagasaki, on the same date, a very different kind of ending produced a very different kind of beginning. Singapore had joined the Federation of Malaysia in 1963, hoping that unity would bring stability and strength. Instead, deep racial tensions and political disagreements between Singaporean leaders and the federal government in Kuala Lumpur made the union unworkable. On August 9, 1965, the Malaysian parliament voted to expel Singapore from the Federation entirely. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, who had fought for years to keep the Union together, announced Singapore's sudden independence in a televised address. Visibly emotional, uncertain whether the tiny, resource-poor island could survive on its own. It had no natural resources, limited fresh water, and a population many believed was too small to sustain a modern economy. Under Lee's leadership, Singapore would instead become one of the most remarkable development stories of the 20th century. Proof that an unwanted ending can become the foundation for something no one thought possible. 4 years after Singapore's independence, on the same date, a very different story unfolded in the hills above Los Angeles, one that would come to symbolize the end of the 1960s idealism. In the early hours of August 9, 1969, members of a cult led by Charles Manson entered a home in Benedict Canyon and killed 5 people, including actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant. The murders shocked a country already unsettled by war and social upheaval, and the trial that followed, and the cultural fascination with Manson himself, became a grim marker of how quickly the era's optimism could curdle into fear. It remains one of the most studied crimes in American history, not for any glorification it deserves, but for what it revealed about the fragility of the decade's utopian hopes. Five years after that dark night in Los Angeles, on the same date, an American presidency ended not with violence, but with a single word, spoken on television the night before: resign. Facing near certain impeachment over the Watergate scandal, Richard Nixon became the only U.S. president in history to resign from office. His resignation officially took effect at noon on August 9, 1974, the moment Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th President of the United States. Ford's first words to the nation were simple: "Our long national nightmare is over." There was no coup, no crisis of succession, no violence in the streets, just a peaceful, constitutionally ordered transfer of power, exactly as the system had been designed to provide. In a stretch of history dominated by wars, bombs, and empires collapsing under force, it was, in its own way, one of August 9th's quietest miracles. Proof that a democracy can survive even the failure of the person leading it. 10 events, 17 centuries, one date. An emperor who rode to his own death, certain of a victory he'd never earn. A writer who spoke to an audience that hadn't been born yet. A runner who answered hatred with speed. Diplomats drafting hope before the war was even one. A movement that could be arrested but never truly imprisoned. Sailors who refused to accept that their lives mattered less. A bomb that ended a war and opened an age of dread. A nation forced into existence by rejection, and one that thrived anyway. A night that reminded a hopeful decade of its limits. And a presidency that ended exactly the way its founders intended. Peacefully and on time. August 9th doesn't tell one story. It tells the same story, over and over, in different centuries. Power is never as permanent as it feels, and the moment it breaks is usually the moment something else begins. If this date taught the world anything, it's that history isn't waiting for the next big anniversary. It's happening on every single day of the calendar. If you want to see what else the past has hidden in plain sight, explore another day in history with us, right here on 360 Day Lore.